Hey everybody, welcome back to Style Sew Me. Today we're talking about how to sew a straight stitch. You've got your new sewing machine, or at least it's new to you, and you've got it threaded and you're like, I don't know what to do. You stepped on the sewing pedal, you just went pedal to the metal, and your sewing stitches look like the yellow brick road. I'm here to help you get your stitching straight. It's very easy, just takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of patience. First thing you want to do is you want to start off with your fabric being cut properly. I've cut 2 strips of muslin. This is just a simple cotton fabric because it's much easier to start practicing on non-stretchy fabric. This fabric does not stretch. Working with stretchy fabric or textured fabric like sequins or faux fur or something like that can be a little bit more challenging, but this is a great starting point. So you want to make sure that your edges are nice and even. You want to make sure that you don't have any severely jagged edges because you're lining up your edges, and if they don't match then the way they're supposed to, then your stitching is going to be a bit skewed. If you don't have any fabric yet, don't worry. Just grab an old pillowcase. That works perfectly fine. Now, if you are working with a pattern, the most common seam allowance, which is the distance between the stitching and the edge of the fabric, is 5/8 of an inch. The seam allowance is, if there's stitching right here, then this is your seam allowance. I'll explain more about that in a minute. But you want to know what your seam allowance is before you get started. The most common seam allowance, as I mentioned, is 5/8 of an inch. But I know that when you're sewing pockets, the common seam allowance there is 3/8 of an inch. A lot of independent patterns, or just some tutorials that you may find online, some people like to use 1/2 inch seam allowance. So again, you want to check your instructions and identify what your seam allowance is. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to use 5/8 of an inch. All right, let's go to the sewing machine. The way to practice sewing straight seams is to practice on paper. And I've actually created these practice sheets with the Style Sew Me logo, and it's available. I will make sure to put the link in the description box, but it's free and you can print as many as you like. Now, you're not going to use thread with this. You're simply going to sew onto this sheet without any thread. But when you sew on paper, it's going to dull your needle. So when you're finished practicing, just go ahead and throw your needle out. You don't want to use a dull needle on your fabric because it's not going to stitch it properly, and it could actually tear your fabric. So let me show you how to do that. So right now my sewing machine is threaded. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to pull my threading out of the machine. I'm just pulling it out very gently and laying it off to the side. And my bobbin thread is here, but I don't have to worry about that. It's not going to catch on anything, so I'll just leave it out of the way. So now my needle is empty. Now here you're not going to worry about your seam allowances because what you're focusing on doing is sewing on these beautiful purple lines. So you're going to line up the line with your needle. You're going to lower your presser foot, lower your needle, and you're going to sew. On the slowest comfortable or the fastest comfortable speed for you, which for the purposes of this tutorial I'm going to use the slowest speed, I want you to just sew. You're concentrating on keeping the needle onto the line. Now when you're sewing with fabric, you are actually not going to be looking at the needle, you're going to be looking at your seam guide. But for the purposes of practicing and just learning how to control and being more comfortable with your sewing machine, I want you to kind of watch your needle just a bit. Okay. So now I am lined up on the line, and I'm simply letting the machine do what it does. It's pulling the fabric through, which is the piece of paper. I can let go of it. It's doing what it does. And the needle is striking on the purple line because I'm guiding the fabric and I'm making sure that it's staying where it needs to be. And because I'm comfortable, I can speed it up a bit, but I don't want you to feel like you need to speed it up. I want you to go slow and make sure that you're getting comfortable with your machine. Okay. And as you can see, I've sewn a straight stitching on that purple line. So I want you to practice on this sheet. Here are the lines for you to practice. And once you finish with this, just throw it away or recycle it, better yet, and print out another one and just keep practicing. And then you can move on to your fabric, and that way you're not wasting your fabric. For this part of the tutorial, you are going to need pins and you're going to need fabric. So when we're talking about seam allowance, we're actually talking about the distance between the needle strike, where the stitching is, and the edge of the fabric. And we've already identified that the seam allowance that we're going to use is 5/8 of an inch. There are numbers on your plate here, and these actually indicate some increments of seam allowance. Not all of them, but some of them. Your most common. You have 1/4 of an inch, it's back behind your presser foot here, 5/8 of an inch, which is right here, 1 inch, and 2. And again, we are looking at 5/8 of an inch, so we're looking at this line right here. To get started, we are going to look at the stitch. We are using a standard straight stitch, and if you need to know what type of stitch you're looking at, your sewing machine comes with a guide here, and we're doing stitch 0, and that's indicated right here. Some machines have a dial, and some it's actually computerized, and so you would just adjust this as needed. This is your speed control. I'm comfortable sewing on a high speed, but that's because I've been sewing for a while. But I want you to start out on your highest comfortable speed, and if that speed is low, then so be it. Don't rush. Remember, quality, quality. This is your back stitch. This button is like, it looks like a U-turn arrow, and what this is it indicates reinforcement stitch. You're going to begin and end your most stitches with this, and for the purpose of using a straight stitch, you always want to reinforce. This makes sure that the seam stays in place. This is your presser foot, and we lower the presser foot with the lever that's right back here, and it keeps the fabric in place. Your sewing machine will not sew without it, and mine tells me with this big red button here that I'm not able to do anything until I lower my presser foot, in which it turns green. So I've got my fabric here lined up, and to hold the fabric together, you use pins. Good rule of thumb is pin as much as you need to pin. So you're simply piercing the pin through the fabric, and you're going to come back out, making sure you secured both layers of fabric. And you need to pin as often as you need to pin. If that's every couple of inches up here, then that's what you do. If it's a little further down, then that's what you do. Don't feel pressured by what you see anyone else do. Your job is to do what's comfortable for you. And I also tell you that based on what type of fabric that you use, you're going to need more or less pins. If it's slippery and just very difficult to control with even the most experienced seamstresses, they use pins. Everyone uses pins. So I've identified my seam allowance line. I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric at that line. I'm going to push my fabric back, be about 1/4 of an inch behind my needle, because remember we talked about this back stitch, this reinforcement stitch is going to sew backwards first, and then it's going to sew forward to kind of lock that stitch in place. Oh, one thing before I start, I want to show you the feed dogs. These zigzaggy things here are called feed dogs, and their job is to pull the fabric through. You don't push your fabric, you don't pull your fabric, it does the job for you. Your only job with your hand is to guide the fabric and make sure that it stays lined up with your indicated seam allowance. All right, we're ready to go. So again, at the slow speed, this speed control tells your machine that no matter how hard you press on the pedal, it's not going to go any faster than the slow speed. Lower your presser foot, sew about 2 stitches backwards, which should place you at the top of your fabric, and then press on your pedal to sew down. My eyes are looking here, not here. I'm making sure that my fabric stays lined up. Now, I have pins in my fabric, so what I'm going to do is I don't want to sew over my pins, so when I get close, I'm going to take my pin out. Now I'm going to keep sewing. Now I'm going to speed this up a bit for the purpose of the tutorial. But again, I want you to sew at the speed that's most comfortable for you. Okay, I'm getting close, so I'm going to take out my pin. I'm going to keep sewing. And I'm also double checking my fabric as I sew to make sure it's kind of lined up. Pin's getting close, pin comes out. Sew, sew, sew. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to raise my needle in my presser foot. Cut my thread either on the side here or with scissors, doesn't matter. And we're done. We have sewed this beautiful straight seam, but we're not done yet. Let's go to the ironing board. You definitely want to press your seams open. What do I mean by that? When you've pressed your seam, you're going to open out. Now let me show you what it looks like before. See? It's very neat, but you see how bubbly that is right there, how puffy that is? We don't want that. So we're going to open out with our seam allowance. This is your seam allowance. We're going to press this seam allowance open. So we're simply just going to open it with our fingers, making sure our fabric is flat. And we're going to take an iron on the appropriate temperature, because not all fabrics call for the same temperature. So make sure that you know that. But for this cotton muslin, we're good with a medium to high temperature. And I have my steam iron here. And I'm simply just going to place my iron and press, meaning press down on the seam allowance. I'm not going to iron. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to press down. And you're just going to hold for a couple of seconds. Give it a steam burst if you'd like. See, look, oh, it looks beautiful. One more time. Just a few seconds. And you are done. So let's flip that over. It looks beautiful on the inside. And look at that outside. Look how nice and flat that is. You definitely, I'm just going to iron the rest of the fabric. And you definitely are more than welcome to press the outside of the seam as well. It's just not going to do anything but make it even more flat and more crisp, which is exactly what you want. So there you are, you have sewed a straight stitch. A quick tool to help you with keeping your eye out on your seam allowance is using a magnetic seam guide. It clicks onto your plate because it's magnetic, and it allows you to keep your fabric flush up against. So if you're having a bit of a time trying to make sure that your fabric is controlled and it's maybe wobbling all over the place and you just don't feel like you have some control, make sure, go pick one up. It's only a few bucks. So I back stitch and I start my stitching, and all I'm doing is making sure that that fabric stays flush up against that seam guide. Think of it as the bumpers for when you go bowling. It's no shade. Back stitch at the end. Raise your needle and you're done. See? Perfect stitching. So I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial on sewing a straight stitch. And if you have any questions or comments, make sure to comment below. And make sure to subscribe to my channel, and make sure to subscribe to my blog, Style Sew Me, to make sure you don't miss any of this great content.